So I was very excited when I was invited to this panel, but then the closer I came to the date, the more nervous I became, because even though I think of myself as a politically committed person, and I think of some of what I write as literature, I've actually never thought about what is politically committed literature. And then it occurred to me that I was sitting in a panel with people who spend their whole life writing about literature and political commitment and Marxism. So I had this kind of imposter syndrome, and I decided that the only productive thing that I could do was to try and reflect inductively from my work on the relationship between literature and political commitment. Starting with the book that Esther mentioned, Free, which was a coming-of-age story. It was a story of growing up in communist Albania and the transition to communism, from communism to capitalism, then maybe eventually to communism later. But it was a book that was translated in many languages and won many prizes, and when I was invited by the current Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama, who wanted to congratulate me on the success of this book, he said, "Yeah, congratulations, but you know, you shouldn't be very proud of it because you didn't really write the book." And I said, "What do you mean I didn't write the book? Who wrote the book if it wasn't me?" He said, "Well, it was Enver Hoxha." And this reminded me of the, I hope people know who Enver Hoxha is. So this reminded me of the time in which Pablo Picasso was in Paris drawing a mural for a competition that he was about to enter, and at some point Guernica happened, the attack on Guernica, and he changed the mural completely and started writing the famous mural that we now know as Guernica. And in the various visits from Nazi officers to his study, who would go there with the pretense of taking an interest in his art but really trying to surveil him, they were looking at the mural as it was being made, and so they said to him, "Oh, Picasso, did you make this?" And Picasso, as you probably know the anecdote, turned to them and said, "No, you made it." So I think actually this anecdote resonates with the way in which I always thought about literature and the relationship between art and political commitment. Politically committed literature and art, as I see it, is a kind of activity that tries to refine the lens through which we observe reality and to understand and to interpret the concerns and the commitments of one's contemporaries and to analyze events with an eye to both social critique and to possible alternatives, but also to obstacles to possible alternatives. And a writer is someone who I think just does their role in the division of labor in society, and the writer has a certain kind of toolkit, just as worker has another toolkit and lawyer has yet another toolkit and so on. And going back to Picasso, at one point Picasso was asked to elaborate on this account and on his approach, which, as I say, was roughly similar to the one that I have just described on the relationship between art and politics. And he reportedly says to, this is an interview in 1945 that he gives to a magazine, where he says, "What do you think is an artist?" Quote, "A fool who has only eyes if he's a painter, only ears if he's a musician, only a liar for all the chords of the heart if he's a poet, or even if he's a boxer, only muscles." Now, I don't know why he thought of boxers as artists, but the rest of the sentence leads to his conclusion, which is, again, quote, "Painting is not made to decorate houses, it's a weapon of offensive and defensive war against the enemy." So this leads to the second part of my intervention, which is who is the enemy and the connection between politically committed literature and the Marxist tradition. So who is the enemy? If you're a Marxist, the enemy is capitalism, or at least one of the enemies is capitalism. If you're an Albanian Marxist like me, it's both capitalism and a certain kind of Marxism itself. And it raises the question, when it comes to political commitment, that kind of Marxism raises the question of the relationship between politically committed literature on the one hand and propaganda on the other. So when does politically committed literature not become propaganda? And I think, as I was trying to sort of theorize and think about this, again, inductively, from both my work and my experiences, the distinction, I think, lies in the relationship to power. So committed literature is a kind of literature that resists power in all its forms. including in the form that power reveals by those who claim to speak in the name of emancipation and liberation. And I think this question of the relationship between literature, politically committed literature, and propaganda is actually a particularly delicate one when one thinks about the legacy of something like socialist realist tradition, again, in my part of the world. When you talk about politically committed literature, people mostly try and think about the years in which painters were told by the League of Artists, actually, the sun is not in the right place in this painting, it's not showing the worker happy enough. Or if you're a writer, someone would say this character actually is too reminiscent of Dostoevsky nihilism, and we don't have enough harmony here, and we don't have an accurate description of social reality. So it seems to me that an effort to think about from a Marxist perspective this question of literature and political commitments needs to somehow confront this double legacy of Marxism, both in the West and also in Eastern Europe and communist world, former communist world. And I think, in a way, this reflects the different approaches that people have to the Marxist tradition in those two parts of the world. So on the one hand, I think in Eastern Europe, when you talk to most people about Marxists, they think of it as life, as a life experiment and a body of experiences that are mainly historical experience and that often are used to discredit the ideas. So the philosophy of Marxism is one thing, the history and the politics of it is another thing, and often many people would use that experience to tell you that actually the ideas are irrelevant and that philosophy is somehow being discredited by the real world. On the other hand, if you think about the legacy of Marxism in the Western world, so a world that hasn't experienced any real world socialism, the attitude is one that only cares about the ideas, and the history and the politics often is the history and the politics of failed experiments where people did something wrong, but something wrong that wasn't really related to the ideas themselves or to the theoretical elaborations. And so on the one hand, you have this kind of Western Marxism, where Marxism is mainly philosophy, and on the other hand, you have the former communist world in which Marxism is mainly life. And as I've been thinking about, what does it mean to be a politically committed writer who thinks about Marxism as both? How does this show in the work, and how does this, and this goes back to some of the things that Terry was saying about in the form. And in my case, this took the form of exploring ideas, both as philosophical ideas, but also as ideas that are actually the ideas in the name of which people live lives and have tried to make sense of the world. And so this effort for me has then turned into a kind of effort to experiment with genre, and in particular to find a middle way between literature on the one hand and philosophy on the other. So maybe I just say a few words on what this means, in my case, to think about both literature and philosophy. And until I started writing in a more literary vein, I had just a philosopher's hat on. And when I was writing philosophy, the idea was that you start with certain convictions, start with a theory, say Marxism or socialism, and you try to prove to your adversaries that the objections are mistaken. And so you have something that follows a reasoning process. You start with certain premises, you try to validate the premises, you then fight the objections, then you get to the conclusions. And of course, if you're trying to write literature, this is a recipe for either propaganda literature or for terrible literature, in which characters become just the puppets of some philosopher who is trying to move them in such a way that they reflect ideas, and they're actually not like real people anymore, because real people are much more complicated than they aren't just the vehicles of ideas. So while philosophy starts with, as I say, ideas and tries to come to certainty, literature challenges that certainty, and so starts with characters and with plot and with detail and with psychological dilemmas, and kind of observes these dilemmas in real life. And this means a kind of, for me, the effort to do both means a blurred form of writing in which the books are driven by philosophical ideas. So one of my books is about freedom, the other one is freedom, the other one is about dignity, the next one is going to be about equality. So the concept sort of helps you shape the book and write in a way that these ideas are present constantly in the discussions, in the conversations. You see how the characters challenge the ideas, how they argue over them, and so on. But on the other hand, the ideas are also have to be, in the literary form, somehow abandoned, and you just have to see what they mean in the lives of people, and in these kind of dramatic historical circumstances. And there, literature acquires, I think, a kind of democratic function that philosophy doesn't have, because it enables you to create more doubt. So you start with the certainties of ideas, and you then see how the ideas shape real lives, and you see how they are present in different characters, and how the characters fight with each other over the ideas, or how they live the implications of the ideas. So then literature becomes something much more complicated, in which you see in the work the tensions that we then see also in the world. So it becomes this kind of mirror to social reality. So on the one hand, as I say, philosophy asks you to constantly argue your standpoint and to defend it and to show the limitation of alternatives. On the other, literature asks you to kind of embrace the alternatives for the sake of challenging the certainty of the ideas and embrace the doubt that philosophy tries to resolve. So the other point that I want to make in relation to this sort of hybrid writing, where I'm trying to engage with this body of ideas as both philosophy and lived experience, is the relationship between history and how we think about historicity and facts. And I think another thing that literature, or maybe politically committed literature, tries to do is to reconstruct the different ways of thinking about history. So one standard way to think about history is to think of it as facts, and the reconstruction of facts, and the search for facts, and the ordering of facts. And so the sense that we access the truth by thinking about facts. But of course, any historian will tell you, facts only lead to the truth if you can trust the mechanism through which facts are transmitted. And again, any historian who has entered an archive or has engaged with historical evidence knows that archives, evidence, are always shaped by some authority that orders the evidence in such a way that it selects certain things as relevant and excludes others. So it makes, at all points, there are heuristic decisions that get made on what to include and what to exclude. And often what's really interesting is what are excluded by the ordering of the facts in a certain way, rather than what the facts themselves are telling you. So in the case of my last book, which was about my grandmother's life and trying to reconstruct her life based on communist surveillance archives, what became very clear very quickly was that you couldn't really trust these surveillance archives. So you went there trying to find the truth of a life, but then what you realize is there are layers and layers of propaganda and ways in which those who report her life are actually constructing it based on their own interests or on their own imperatives or on the things that they haven't that they need to assert somehow. So you then become much more, you just realize that there is the facts of history don't give us an answer when it comes to the question of how can we challenge the interpretation of facts that historical sources give us? How can we challenge the authority of the archive, or how can we challenge the authority of the whichever body has systematized the facts in a certain way? And so then I think what literature does is an alternative approach to history, which isn't factual history, but is something like what German Enlightenment philosophers used to call conjectural history. And conjectural history is history read from a moral standpoint, from a moral perspective, from a perspective that looks at the way in which facts have been ordered and asks itself the question of how has power shaped those facts, and so how can I engage critically with them, how can I resist the way in which power orders the facts, and how can I tell an alternative story that isn't included in the archive, that isn't part of the story that is being told. And in this effort of literature to recover what these German philosophers called conjectural history, or these Enlightenment philosophers called conjectural history, someone like Schiller, for example, thought that that's where the power of art to give us some kind of higher access to a moral truth lies vis-a-vis either politics or history. And what he meant by that was not that the politics was irrelevant, but that when you face yourself with ideology and with propaganda and with manipulation of the facts, the only way that you might have to actually recover some authenticity and a more moral perspective in relationship to the facts is to actually use the writer's imagination. So to go to a perspective on the facts that is not just ordering them, but asking itself the question of how do these facts shape lives, and how do they show up in moral motives, and what are they excluded, and how does the morality of an authority, for example, relate to the morality of human beings more generally. And so in this constant dialogue and interplay, you generate the critical input that is required to read history in a certain way. And when history is read in that way, the point of it is that the reflection on the past then isn't really in reconstructing the truth about the past, but it's rather in somehow unveiling the lies of our time. Because this critical perspective, this approach to the past that asks itself the question of how have these facts been constantly manipulated and shaped for us, the point of that exercise is to actually reflect on your own time and the way in which the facts by which we are surrounded, or the way in which they are interpreted, are no longer taken for granted. And so literature then plays this function of, as I say, challenging history and challenging a certain reading of the facts that teases out a more critical interpretation of social reality. So literature basically embodies a search for agency through which you try to appropriate a world that you don't make from scratch, but that you discover with all its flaws, and literature helps you see where those flaws are, and to which you respond by understanding it, by challenging it, by trying to change what you do. And so in literature understood as this conjectural approach to history, what you discover is then characters, particular characters, but that aren't, according to Schiller, just particular characters, but that they are models of humanity as a whole. So these characters are actually there as reflections of a moral idea, and that's why he thought that the aesthetic is a symbol for the ethic. And so what you do, you have in literature this kind of cross-spatial, cross-temporal, collective effort through which both the writer and the reader engage critically with the world in which they find themselves. And in constructing this conversation between the writer and the reader, and in this kind of critical engagement with the world in which they find themselves, what they're also doing is prefiguring an alternative world in which there is more social freedom. And I think that's more or less what the meaning of politically committed literature beyond propaganda means. Thank you.